Everybody wave.
Look cute.
Hey everybody.
All right. Okay. Hi everybody, my name is Jamie Scott, and today I will be talking about serial killers and their characteristics and what makes a serial killer. So even though some serial killers are born without the feeling of remorse, other things such as childhood trauma and personal gain can cause people to become murderers. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the definition of a serial killer. So what defines a serial killer? So the FBI defines a serial killer as a person or persons who has killed more than 3 people over a course of a month with a cool-off period in between each killing. So now that we've got the definition down, there are 3 different types of serial killers that I'll be touching on. The first is a medical, the second is organized, and then the third is disorganized. So the medical type of serial killer typically is in a hospital setting or medical setting, and then they are typically thought of as natural deaths, which is how they typically get away with it. So a good example of this would be Harold Shipman. He was a doctor in the UK that was convicted of killing 215 patients and up to 260 patients. So before he killed them, he would usually fix their wills so that he would take in the money after they died. These patients were often old but still healthy, so that's how suspicion began to arise. He was obviously convicted, put in prison, and then committed suicide in prison. So the second type of serial killer is an organized serial killer. These serial killers typically have a higher IQ. They tend to clean up after themselves, cover their tracks, and they're very meticulous. A good example would be Edmund Kemper. So Edmund Kemper had a pretty high IQ and a pretty big build, so he was able to overpower his victims. Another good example of this would be Dexter, if you've ever seen the show Dexter. A disorganized serial killer would be, the exact opposite of an organized serial killer. So they have a lower IQ, they're not very good at cleaning up after themselves, and they typically get caught a lot faster. And then, now that we know the different types, we're going to move on to what really makes a serial killer. So we're going to go into their childhood and history. So typically, if you look at serial killers in their childhood, they have repeated trauma, whether it be physical, mental, even sexual abuse. A good example of this would be Aileen Wuornos, and she was abandoned by her mother at the age of 4 and raised by her grandparents. She was repeatedly abused by her grandfather, who ended up impregnating her at the age of 14. And so she was sent to live in a home with other women who got pregnant at a young age, and she gave that child up for adoption. And so after that, she got into prostitution and ended up shooting and killing 7 men who she claimed abused her, and she was eventually sentenced to the electric chair. Another childhood sign would be showing signs of fantasies, trying to make them become real. We're going to come back to Edmund Kemper, who was abused by his mother as a child by basically neglect. She was a drunk who blamed him for her divorce, and she made him live in the basement. And so he had fantasies of killing his mother and other women that looked like his mother. And so he took this out on killing cats at first, and then his mother couldn't take it anymore, sent him to live out with his grandparents, and then they couldn't take it anymore, so he shot them. Yeah. And so when he was asked why he did so, he felt like it. He is still in prison today. And then, so childhood trauma isn't exactly the only thing that is their motive, basically. That's not their only excuse as to why they do it. There's also power and thrill of the killing, which a good example of this would be Carl Watts. Carl Watts was otherwise known as the Sunday morning slasher. He would go to women's doorsteps and basically slash their throats as they answered the doors. He was a disorganized killer because he didn't try to cover his tracks. He had a very low IQ from having meningitis as a child. He missed a grade and then had to be held back, and that infuriated him even more. He also had fantasies where he killed women and carried that out. Took him a while to get caught though, because he would travel for his job, and so he killed 80 women in 4 different states. Where, I mean, he was eventually convicted of killing 80, even though it was supposedly a much higher number. And then he died of cancer like 2 years after he was convicted. So another reason or motive would be just psychosis, which is no remorse at all. And that's where we would come back to Harold Shipman. He really didn't have any childhood trauma or anything of that sort. His mother did die at a younger age from cancer, but besides that, nothing bad happened in his childhood. He just kind of snapped. And then the last one would be personal gain. So monetary gain, social status gain, anything that would cause them to want to murder for their benefit. A good example of this would be Blanche Taylor Moore, and she is otherwise known as the Black Widow because she poisoned at least 5 men that were romantically involved with her to get their money. As of right now, she is the oldest death row inmate in North Carolina at the age of 86. And so yeah, she definitely just killed for money, and that was her motive. So there is enough evidence that most, but not all, people that commit murder multiple times usually do it for the same reason and because of the same reason. They are all typically related, but not all. And that is my speech.
Great speech. Loved it.
Some applause.